So good afternoon, everyone. Let's get started. So to welcome to everyone for the IfAD Public Talk Series. IfAD stands for the Initiative for Agency and Development. It is a university-wide initiative at University of Arizona. And since 2020, we have been working with uh, a large variety of actors that are vital for international development around the world. So for external participants, what we do, IFAD is, our focus is on issues of agency, poverty, and development. We are a group of interdisciplinary scientists and scholars, and we work with mainly international institutions, as I mentioned. We have ongoing relationship with World Bank, UNDP, International Fund for Agricultural Development, and we closely work with various foundations and regional governments in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and more so now in Caribbean. So with that said, it is my pleasure to uh, introduce our speaker today, Zohra Khan. And Zohra is a senior policy advisor to UN Women today. I have been a long time fan of her work, and many of you who are regular for IFAD programming, you know that we had a pleasure of having her as one of the panelists for when we had a workshop with World Bank on women, business and law. Zohra, do you remember that a couple of years ago?
Very well.
Yeah. So since then, it has been my intention to be able to get Zohra for IFAD Public Talk Series, and I'm glad that she's joining today. So at UN, she spearheads, leads the UN Women's Gender Budgeting and Financing Program, and she has over 25 years experience in across the world in Asia, Africa, and Europe, and she is the pioneer pioneer in the field of shaping fiscal policies for gender programming, particularly with focus with livelihood programs for women around the world. And before that, she played a very vital role in legal reforms in post-apartheid Africa. Before that, she was One World Action's she was gender policy officer, where she focused on analyzing the impact of international aid and trade on women's livelihood. She is, as you can see, I don't want to go in at length, but she is someone whose life has been committed to the empowerment of women, justice, and equality. So it is really, really a great pleasure to have her. On a personal note, many of you who know me personally, you know that I myself is also motivated largely by societal impact. So I care about fundamental economic research, but at the same time, my primary motivation is to make whatever we do relevant for the communities, particularly the people at the margin. So from that point of view, I'm a huge fan of Zohra. Her impact around the world on development policy, not just on gender policy, has been far, far consequential. And she continues to do so today. So it is great pleasure to have you, Zohra, today, and thank you for doing it. Just for a few logistical issues, Zohra is going to summarize the state of the world in 3 minutes. No, just joking. She's going to talk for 40 to 50 minutes. And then we will have close to 30 minutes for question and answer. So if you have any question, please leave it to the end, because this is a Zoom talk. One limitation is that you can't have back and forth in between. And when we have a question answer session, please use the Zoom feature to raise your hand and I'll call you and you can directly ask Zohra about it. That said, Zohra, now the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Thohid, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, colleagues, for joining a talk on a Friday afternoon about gender equality and financing for gender equality in particular. So thank you again to the Initiative for Agency and Development at the University of Arizona and Prof. Rahman for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be with you and to share a few thoughts on a topic that affects every single one of us, which is how we finance sustainable development and the future we want. And I would actually add the future we need, because many of the issues that I will raise today are existential issues. There are issues about our planet, the people on the planet, and how we can together forge a sustainable path forward. So these are very big and challenging questions that we're dealing with right now. So, as you've heard, I spent much of my career working at the intersection of global finance, development, and gender equality. I started my career back in South Africa several years ago during a very exciting period just after the downfall of apartheid, and did lots of work around research and how we could write better laws and policies that integrated women's needs. That was a very exciting exercise to participate in and to contribute to. But at the back of my mind was always, how do we finance our development? How do we finance our national action plans, our national development plans, to make sure that we leave no one behind, to use the jargon of the UN, but we were talking about leaving no one behind way before the adoption of the 2030 agenda. So I think is incredibly important to understand that when we talking about these issues, they really do come from a long history of work that feminist economists have done, that feminist activists have done, which is really about putting women's issues at the center of economic policy and fiscal policies and indeed development policy. But my work has also shown me that how we mobilize and use resources, whether they're public resources or private, it can either hold back progress on gender equality or accelerate it dramatically. So the choices we make around financing, around what we budget for, and how we actually spend those resources is incredibly important. So I want to start with a figure that perhaps captures the scale of the challenge that we are faced with today. So an estimated 4 trillion US dollars is needed in developing countries to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. Prior to the COVID pandemic, the financing gap was 2.5 trillion. So the pandemic, climate shocks, the economic shocks that came from the pandemic and the debt crises has widened the gap significantly, the financing gap. And at the moment, there's only about 1.4 trillion US dollars that is being mobilized towards implementation of the SDGs. So the purpose of my talk today is to look at some of these stats, to unpack some of these stats, and to see where we stand, to understand some of the barriers that keep financing from reaching the SDGs, and to consider the bold shifts we need, both in terms of policy, economic policy, social policy, and so on, but also in terms of practice and implementation, in order for us to unlock investments that are not just large scale, because we need significantly larger investment in development and in gender equality in particular, but it also needs to be inclusive and sustainable investments. So they need to be including everyone, and to make sure that they are sustainable. So it's not just a one-off, that it actually builds our economies and builds our societies. So, as some of you may know, we've been grappling with these questions for many years now. Of course, it's taken on a much more intense role now, but over 20 years ago, in 2002, governments met in Monterrey, Mexico, and agreed on a framework to address financing for development. And this was known as the Monterrey Consensus, and this really recognized the central role of finance in ending poverty and promoting sustainable development. So it was a very, very important founding document. Since then, we've vastly expanded the normative frameworks to include the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals and or Agenda 2030, as it's known, the Paris climate commitments, and just a couple of months ago, in July, the Severe Compromiso, which is the outcome of the fourth International Conference on Financing for Development. But even with all that progress, the gap between our ambitions and our vision and the actual financing available for implementation has never been greater. And it's only widening in our crisis-prone world. So today I want to talk about not just the problem, but about the potential. How smart strategic financing can be an engine that propels us back on track, and why it matters for all of us, not just for governments or institutions. So I want to spend a few minutes on the global context and look at where we are. And all of the stats that I will mention today and all of the data points are available in reports, and we will direct you to those reports, UN reports, at the end of this talk. So when the world adopted the 2030 Agenda, the vision was very bold: end poverty, protect the planet, ensure prosperity for all. But if we take an honest look today, the gap between ambition and reality is quite wide. For developing countries, the OECD estimates that the financing gap has grown by more than 50%, 50, since 2020. And they attribute this to the loss of tax revenues, to lower economic growth overall, to lack of FDI, first from the pandemic and then from subsequent crises that have become compounding crises. So all of this has just kind of come together to form the perfect storm in many ways. When we break down these figures, we see that middle income countries carry the largest gaps in absolute terms, but the pressure is most severe for low income countries and LDCs. For them, the financing gap ranges between 15 to 30% of GDP. And just to put this in perspective, the IMF calculates that just to make progress on 5 core SDGs, health, education, water and sanitation, and electricity and roads, countries need to invest over 16% of GDP by 2030. And this is simply beyond the reach of many countries without major changes in the global financing architecture. So globally, 25 developing countries dedicate more than a fifth of their total revenue to servicing public external debt alone. And we know from our colleagues in UNCTAD or from UNCTAD reports that 3.3 billion people live in countries where government spends more on interest repayments than on education or health. So the debt burdens that governments carry really crowd out SDG investment in financing, and they threaten debt crises for more than half of all LDCs and other low-income countries. And these have been assessed as either being high risk or already in debt distress. So it's quite a dire situation. So this is what the United Nations calls the Great Finance Divide. Developing countries face consistently worse terms of access to both long-term and concessional financing. In the current environment, their borrowing costs are sometimes more than double those of developed economies. But here's what this means in practice. Supposing we have a country, and we'll call it country A, that's a developed economy, and it borrows at 2% interest. So for a 1 billion solar farm, it pays 20 million a year in interest. Country B, a developing economy, borrows at 8% for the same project. Its annual interest bill, 80 million, so 4 times higher. And this difference, the 60 million difference, could easily have funded schools, hospitals, or climate resilience. Instead, it goes to creditors. So this is how financial structures and our financial architecture entrench inequalities, making it much more difficult for countries that need investment to actually secure it at an affordable rate and to prioritize investment in social infrastructure that is so badly needed, and indeed social infrastructure that's needed to then support economic growth in these countries. So what does the financing gap mean for gender equality? So we know through our research that UN Women and UN DESA have conducted that developing countries need an additional 420 billion every year to achieve gender equality objectives. And this is not all of the goals, it's just or all of the targets, it's just some of them. But yet we see continued underinvestment, and this is underinvestment in gender equality, and this is failing women and girls. And it's also stalling progress on SDG 5. We have recently, just this week, released the 2025 Gender Snapshot. And what it shows us is that the world is retreating from gender equality, and this cost is counted in lives, rights, and opportunities. So if current trends continue, the world will reach 2030 with 351 million women and girls still living in extreme poverty. And the SDG, particularly SDG 5, will not be achieved. Another big finding from our SDG snapshot is that new technologies and global shocks risk compounding existing inequalities. Climate change could push as many as 158 million more women into poverty by 2050, nearly half in sub-Saharan Africa. Generative AI could strip away 28% of women's jobs compared to 21% of men's, with the deepest losses among young, educated women. So the backsliding on gender equality is a political choice, and it can be reversed. Investing in gender equality can generate massive windfalls in global GDP and can lift millions of women out of poverty. But despite the benefit of investing in gender equality and women's empowerment, we see that governments are not doing the needful. According to the OECD, less than 7% of bilateral aid has gender equality as its principal objective. In fact, if we look at the period 2022 to 2023, only 6.17% of ODA marked gender equality as a principal objective, and 46% had gender equality as a significant objective, which means it's important, but it's not the primary purpose of a development of a particular spending threshold. And then a big blind spot is, of course, the care economy. With proper investment, quality care services could generate 300 million jobs by 2035 while enabling women to fully participate in the labor market. Instead, care services remain chronically underfunded, leaving households, and particularly women, to carry the burden of care. And as we know, when crises hit, when there are big economic shocks, and we've seen this through COVID, but also more recently through the impacts of wars and natural disasters and so on, that care work for women dramatically increases. Another interesting statistic from UN Women that we found is that in 2024, more than 676 million women lived within 50 kilometers of a deadly conflict, the highest number in decades. So armed conflict overall rose to 61 active wars, displacing more than 123 million people worldwide. Yet as countries pour trillions into military spending, aid flows remain comparatively small. In fact, it's going in the opposite direction. The UN Secretary General's report on women, peace and security recently noted with concern that global military expenditure reached an all-time high of 2.4 trillion in 2023, marking a 6.8% increase from 2022. And since then, our report shows that it's now at 2.7 trillion. So to put it bluntly, colleagues, we spend more on wars than we do on financing peace and development, and indeed gender equality. So the lesson for us is clear. Financing choices are not neutral. They shape who gets protected, who gets left behind, and whether our global commitments remain words on paper or become lived realities. So I want to segue now into a bit of what the normative framework entails and what it looks like, because the normative framework is incredibly important to hold states accountable for the commitments that they made. So to move away from the challenges and to really look at how far we've come. So financing for development in terms of a normative framework, we're not starting from scratch. We are standing on more than 2 decades of global cooperation, and I've already mentioned the Monterey Consensus, back in 2002. It was adopted, but marked the first time that governments came together to link financing directly with the development agenda. And it established that achieving sustainable development would require mobilizing resources from all sources, public, private, domestic, and international. So it's not just about aid and what donors are contributing, but it looked at the entire ecosystem of financing. Another important normative agreement was the 2005 Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness. The Paris Declaration was important because it committed donors to fully align their support to recipient country priorities and needs. And what it did was really strengthen the principles of aid delivery. So it focused on harmonization, on results, on mutual accountability. And there was a big shift in language to partnerships and development cooperation rather than aid and recipient countries. In 2008, in Qatar, Doha, there was a second international conference on financing for development. And this reaffirmed the need for more predictable, effective, and untied aid. It also urged the mobilization of greater FDI and the strengthening of trade cooperation between countries. But also in 2008, as you know, there was a significant event that took place, which was the financial and economic crisis. And in 2009, the UN responded by having a conference on unpacking what the impact of the financial economic crisis was on development and how we could change course. Two other very important normative agreements that member states have reached in 2015, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which really built on this foundation. This broadened the financing conversation to reflect the ambitions of the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement, because all three, the 2030 Agenda, Paris Agreement, and the financing Addis Ababa Action Agenda were all being negotiated at the same time. So there was lots of discussions amongst member states about how the three agreements could reinforce each other. But what it did was really recognized that the SDGs demanded increased financing both in scale and in scope. Addis also anchored commitments around domestic resource mobilization, tax cooperation, and of course the role of private investment in development. And then fast forward to this year, in June, July, we met in Spain at the fourth International Conference on Financing for Development, which took place in Seville. And by consensus, governments adopted the Seville Compromiso, which is a renewed global framework designed to meet the urgency of today's financing crises. And along it, coalitions of governments, institutions, and stakeholders launched 130 initiatives under the Severe Platform for Action, which were or are aimed at really bringing together stakeholders to vastly increase financing for sustainable development. And within that, UN Women, in partnership with other governments and with civil society and multilateral development banks and so on, launched two initiatives, one on the care economy and the importance of centralizing the care economy in discussions on financing for development, and a second looking at financing development in terms of the kinds of partnerships or the kinds of partners and stakeholders that needed to come together to increase the volume of financing for gender equality. So I believe that these conferences really, and especially the last one, really lays a very clear roadmap for actions for both member states as well as other institutional actors. But for us, I think it laid down three big steps forward. The one is the importance of catalyzing investments to close the 4 trillion SDG financing gap. And this includes tripling the lending capacity of MDBs, of multilateral development banks, doubling support to countries to raise revenues to at least 15% of GDP for social spend or for SDG spend, and creating stronger incentives to crowd in private investment. So that's the first. The second big gain was around addressing debt and the sustainable development crisis. Severe launched several new tools to support governments, including a debt swap hub, a global debt registry, a debtors forum where borrowing countries can have a stronger collective voice. Importantly, there are also new commitments to include pause clauses in loan contracts to give countries some breathing space, and also giving vulnerable countries, especially giving vulnerable countries greatest breathing space when disasters strike. And I think that we can see this very kind of clearly across the world now, that there are countries that are in very bad situations. But most important was, of course, reforming the international financial architecture. And this means enhancing the voices of developing countries in the IMF, in the governance of the IMF, creating faster access to emergency financing, and of course, reshaping development cooperation so it's more coherent at both national and global levels. And this is really, I think, picking up from the Paris Principles, from the kind of unmet ambition of what development cooperation can look like in today's day and age, with the emergence of more South-South collaboration and cooperation, and more donors from the South and from the East that are huge players in development cooperation today. So certainly a shift from before. But beyond these milestones, they've also been important in financing innovations. In recent years, we've seen a rise of gender-responsive budgeting, which is an area that I work on, gender lens investing, sustainability-linked debt instruments. And these are not just concepts, they're real tools that have helped countries direct resources to gender equality and women's empowerment. And I'd just like to share three examples from work that UN Women is currently supporting in India, Morocco, and Albania, that shows that with political will and with capacity, governments can actually raise and spend the resources that they need to meet their gender equality objectives in their sustainable development plans. So India stands out as a good example of how sustained political will, commitment, and institutional mechanisms can advance gender responsive financing. In its 2025-26 union budget, India allocated approximately 8.86 of total public expenditure to gender-focused programs. This is the highest share to date, by the way. It marked a significant increase from the previous years, and I think it's in the range of 36 billion US dollars or 38 billion US dollars. But it more importantly reflects a deliberate attempt or deliberate effort by the Indian government to embed gender equality into its fiscal policy. Importantly, ministries including civil aviation and renewable energy, which are not your kind of traditional gender ministries, are now making gender-specific allocations. So this is incredibly important because these are mainstream allocations. And to support this, India uses a set of tools, including an annual gender budget statement, which sets out the government's priorities, the ministerial gender budget cells. Of course, it's improved its collection and use of sex-aggregated data, and that's been very important to make these investments, and ongoing capacity development of civil servants. So making sure that those working in ministries of finance and so on have the tools, and sector ministries as well, have the tools and the know-how for how to integrate gender in their planning. Morocco is another leading example of how GRB can be built into a national system. Morocco has an organic budget law where GRB is actually a legal requirement. So it's something that the government ministries actually have to do because it's set out in law. The government has set up a GRB Center of Excellence. It's trained staff across ministries, including auditors and budget officials. It's applied practical tools like gender analysis and a gender marker system to track the extent to which budgets support gender equality. So this is incredibly important and useful. And as a result of this, gender equality is now considered at every stage of the budget. So the ministry set very clear gender goals, and Parliament receives regular reports, and they actually call the gender reports, to ensure accountability for the spend. So to ensure that the officials and the government is actually spending money the way it's supposed to be intended. So is it meeting its development objectives in that regard? Albania is a good example of how civil society and governments can work together. So civil society plays a critical role in as a watchdog, I would say, role, and in holding local governments accountable. So in 2024 alone, GRB watchdog reports were developed across 5 local governments in partnership with national actors, 35 national actors. There's work ongoing on applying GRB tools throughout the budget cycle to achieve concrete outcomes, and they have achieved concrete outcomes. To illustrate, over 29,000 women survivors of violence have accessed improved services. Over 8,000 female-headed households have received economic assistance. Over 50,000 mothers and children have benefited from enhanced maternal and child health care in 2024. So, really practical examples of how we can use fiscal policies to advance gender equality goals. So, yes, the financing gap is daunting, but the trajectory from Monterey to Addis to Sevilla, in my view, show us something very important. It shows us that when countries commit to high level and good normative standards, when they join forces and recognize the urgency, they can create frameworks and tools that move the dial. So, what does it mean for the road ahead? If we agree that the current trajectory is not sufficient, what are some of the bold shifts we need that will actually make a difference? And we've identified 6 of these. First, reforming the international financial architecture. Right now, the rules of the game are tilted against low and middle income countries. If these economies are paying twice the borrowing costs compared to advanced economies, they're already starting the race uphill. So, reform for us means giving developing countries a stronger voice in institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, but also thinking differently about social safety nets. So that when any crisis strikes, countries don't have to choose between servicing debt and servicing their people. And there's lots of discussion right now around how global safety nets can be designed in a way that actually prevents countries from having to make these tough and quite unfair choices. The second is around creating better debt relief and restructuring mechanisms. Debt workouts today are slow, unpredictable, and often too little, too late. So the need for frameworks that not only reduce debt burdens, but also protect social spending. If governments are forced to cut health and education just to repay creditors, then we undermine the very foundations of sustainable development. So that's why new approaches like pause clauses, debt swaps for climate, and stronger debt coordination platforms are incredibly important. A third is scaling up inclusive finance. We know that meeting the financing needs requires more than just public finance, but we need to leverage private capital much more effectively. And we've seen lots of examples of this across the world: green bonds, sustainability linked instruments, and blended finance. But there has to be a condition underlying these investments. They have to be climate and gender responsive, because too often private finance flows to projects that are mostly commercially safe, but socially, don't meet the needs of countries and of the needs of populations. So the challenge ahead is around redirecting capital towards the transitions that truly matter. So this is around women's economic empowerment, including things like clean energy, resilient infrastructure, the care economy, and so on. Fourth, mobilizing more domestic resources. We need stronger and fairer tax systems. This is absolutely key. This means broadening the tax base, and that means taxing the rich, or making sure that the rich pay their fair share of taxes, cracking down on illicit financial flows, and ensuring that multinational corporations pay their fair share. But equity is just as important as efficiency. So a tax system that leans heavily on VAT, for example, will definitely end up hurting low-income households, especially women. In the FFD space, there's lots of discussions about how do we make sure that we tax the informal economy. And whilst that's important, I do believe that women want to pay taxes, women work in the informal economy. It has to be done in a way that's fair, and it has to be done in a way that ensures that women get something in return. So better safety, better access to public services, and so on. So domestic resource mobilization or domestic mobilization systems must be designed in ways that protect the vulnerable and reduce inequality, especially gender inequality. Fifth is advancing gender responsive budgeting and finance. This is a strategy that often is misunderstood. It is not about creating a separate budget for women. It means looking at how every budget decision a government makes impacts men and women differently and adjusting allocations so that public resources reduce and not reinforce gender inequality. So I've spoke to some examples from Morocco, India and Albania, but there's several examples around the world. UN Women supports gender responsive budgeting in over 100 countries. And it has shown that gender responsive budgeting not only ensures that better resources are directed towards programs that close gender gaps, but that GRB can improve transparency, strengthen accountability in government systems. So it's really about strengthening the institutions and strengthening the systems to make them more effective and work for everyone. And finally, partnerships for innovations. Governments cannot close the financing gap alone. Development finance institutions, IFIs, private investment, civil society each have a role. And the good news is that we're already seeing quite creative coalitions emerge, whether it's MDBs working with philanthropy on blended finance or working cooperatives shaping local government investment and priorities. The key is how we scale these partnerships, but also how we keep them anchored in the goals of inclusion, resilience, and sustainability. So taken together, we believe that these pathways are practical steps to vastly increasing financing for sustainable development and for gender equality. So reforming the rules, protecting people, unlocking capital, making tax fairer, embedding gender equality and building coalitions. These are all the levers that we see that can shift the financing system from being part of the problem to part of the solution. So just I have 5 more minutes, I think, or 2 more minutes, I'm not sure, but to just reiterate the urgency, the window to achieve the SDGs is closing really fast. We only have 5 years. We've discussed that financing is not gender neutral. It can either entrench inequalities or drive transformation. There is for sure many normative frameworks that serve as guiding or guidance for us, but we need bold political will and collective action to make sure that resources are channeled towards inclusive, sustainable, and gender equal development. And I will end on this note. And I think this is incredibly important for us to all recognize that financing gender equality is not a cost. It is a smart investment. It's one of the smartest investments that a society can make because it unlocks potential, it drives investment, but most importantly, it ensures that women's rights are realized and it ensures gender justice for all women and girls. Thank you very much, and I will stop there.
Thank you, Jorat, for wonderful talk. And so now we will open up for the question and Q&A. So anyone who has a question, please go ahead. Unmute and ask.
Hi, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Charles.
Hi. My name is Charles Nucer. I'm a faculty member in the economics department here at the University of Arizona. And my thought is, so thank you for the great talk. I learned a lot from the talk. You focused on institutional and economic reforms as a means to promote gender equality. I mean, my sense is that the institutional economic reforms interact with the sort of social and cultural environment that they find themselves in. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how to promote kind of a norm or the acceptance of gender equality kind of in a social cultural environment. So for example, how to intervene in the education system at kind of a early level to try to promote attitudes of gender equality, or perhaps encouraging women to kind of seek political office or political power in places where that's possible.
Go ahead,
Yeah, I
Zohra.
think Charles froze for a second.
I
So,
froze for a second. I'm back now. I'm sorry.
yeah, go ahead, Charles.
Okay, so I guess so my thought was, how does the institutional and economic reforms that you've discussed, my thought is that they interact with the social cultural environment.
Mm,
And I'm wondering how one can intervene, if you have any thoughts about how one can intervene to make more fertile ground for such institutions to be successful. So things like, encouraging women to seek political power in countries where that's possible, or intervening in early education to promote early childhood education, or at some stage to promote attitudes of gender equality. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that kind of dimension.
sure. Should we take a few?
No, no, Zohra, go ahead.
Yeah.
Address him.
Yeah, Charles, I couldn't agree more. My work here at UN Women is on financing for gender equality. So my talk was kind of skewed more towards the economic and the financial. But I fully agree with you. I mean, much of what we do at UN Women is around supporting countries in designing laws and policies that allow women to take up some of these leadership roles that you mentioned, because it's absolutely critical. We have also programs that work on girls' education and so on. So it definitely is a kind of systemic and holistic approach to gender equality that's needed. And when we work in countries, we do so at the invitation of governments. And so we direct it a lot by what governments need and what governments are asking in terms of technical support and assistance. But I fully agree with you that it's absolutely important to make sure that we are supporting governments to design policies and programs around making sure that we look at gender equality and women's empowerment from the time girls are in school all the way to adulthood. We talk about the life cycle approach. I mean, that's exactly what the life cycle approach is, right? It's to make sure that there are opportunities and entry points for women to be fully integrated into society at every point, and starts with from the access to health, maternal health, education opportunities, leadership, and so on. So I don't at all see these as separate tracks or anything. It's just that my talk just focused on the economic and financial because of where I come from. But it's 100%. When we're giving technical advice, it's all of those things.
Thanks. Thank you.
So, Charles, one thing before we let another question to come. So, Charles, just to follow up Zohra, and we have talked about it. At the World Bank, there has been a lot of interesting initiatives on promoting women's participation that you were talking about institutional, they have a group called Women, Business and Law. So they are trying to track uh, how institutional laws, regulations limit women's gender inequality, or that how so at the World Bank there is a lot of effort on that. But you are absolutely critical, that 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 institutional reform, cultural aspect is really important. So with that, Joanna, now please feel free to ask the question.
Hey, I don't know if you can hear me right. My Zoom is like back and forth. Thanks, Sarah, for the presentation. I am a PhD student in public policy at OSU, Oregon State University, and I'm doing my research about like anti-poverty programs in Colombia. I am from Colombia. So yeah, we are like basically researching about like how these anti-poverty programs are like helping or not, like they are having an impact in the variables that we wanted, that we are doing. So my question for you, Sora, is like where to look for funding. It seems like nowadays with this like current like environment, like political environment, it seems like gender is not like in the agenda. It is like, it seems like, um, I don't know what it is in the agenda right now, honestly, but it is like how to look for funding, how to like make these things relevant, and even like for public agencies that it seems that they are also struggling with budget. So yeah, that will be my question. And the second one, it is like, could we have access to the slides to this recording? It will be great. I have other classmates that it is also researching about this topic, so we would like to have this information. Thanks.
Yeah, Joanna, thank you so much for that question, and thanks for your work in Colombia. I mean, I think that the state of funding for gender equality and for women's organizations is dire across the world. And UN Women is currently putting out or doing quite a bit of research and surveys and so on to get a sense of what's happening in terms of trends and patterns. And it is incredibly scary. I don't know where you could specifically get funding from for the work that you the important work that you are doing, but I know it's not easy. And I think even within the UN, if you're following at all what's happening at the UN, there are massive, massive budget cuts because I don't know if I'm a little bit in two minds about this because it's clear that the need for increased financing for gender equality is so critical at the moment, right? But I'm not seeing a huge appetite, as I said in my presentation, to be supporting and funding sustainable development. We're seeing very kind of nationalistic approaches to the world today, where countries are really focused on protecting their own national interests. And we see that the development cooperation has gone down, and it certainly is not, even where it exists, it's not very much going towards gender equality. And I showed from the slide at 6.7%. So I think it's even women's organizations would be almost in a worse situation than governments. And I think the solutions now we've seen, the foundations are stepping up, philanthropy is stepping up a lot to fill some of the gaps that governments have created. But I think it's important for us to, continue doing the work that we do as women's organizations, and make sure that we create the demand side for this work and show how important it is. But I don't know where you could get more money from, but I know everyone's struggling now.
Thank you. It's kind of sad, but thank you so much.
Yeah, sorry, on that bleak note.
So, Johra, before somebody else asks, I have series of questions, so just largely inspired by what you shared. So one thing what is your view about the role of other institutions? For example, European Union, AIB, BRIC Bank, National Bank of Development. So China is increasingly becoming important, China, BRIC countries. And so there are a lot of other multilateral development institutions which are outside the international UN system. And particularly in the context of what happened to USAID, in European Union also, many countries around the world, it is now becoming fashionable. International aid is that everybody, it is easy to cut. So what you thought that in addition to reforming the UN system, IMF, World Bank, and increasing the representation of developing countries, what is your thought about bilateral trade, aid, or BRIC-led countries, European Union, or for example, let's say in Africa, is there any discussion about increased mobilization of resources by African Union? So, yes.
Okay, that's a big question, Dohit, and I think one that we can all, I'm sure others have thoughts about this too, and can jump in. But I think what has happened globally, or what is happening globally, around the US kind of withdrawing from the international community. I think that what's happening in Gaza and in Ukraine and other countries, I think that tells us where people's priorities are. And I very clearly said in my presentation that it's concerning that we're funding national interests, we're funding war and conflict, and not seeing the value of funding or financing sustainable development. That's how we build our economies. We build our economies by investing in people's capacities, right? And so that's the one thing. Has the rest of the world, the Indias, the Chinas, the large economies, filled the gap? I don't think so. I don't think they've come up with a good alternate plan. There's a lot of discussion at the UN, and I'm sure in spaces that you all occupy, about the new development architecture, what it should look like. There's discussions around the tax convention and what it should look like. So it's clear that in this geopolitical context that we are in, that there is a lot of scope for new actors, the new actors that you mentioned. Well, they're not new actors. I mean, they're old actors, but perhaps we're not pulling their weight as much as we would have liked them to be having a much greater role in financing sustainable development. The question is, why aren't they doing that? And that's not a question I can answer. I think that's a question to all of us. What is it that's stopping that? And I think it has a lot to do with people being very fearful right now, and people wanting to kind of look inward much more. So how do we protect our national interests? How do we protect our economies? Are we scared of tariffs? So let's not piss off anyone right now, because we need to be making deals behind doors and all of that. None of that is good for global cooperation. None of that is good for sustainable development. And so even the philanthropic organizations, I think, that have stepped in and are increasing, some of them massively increasing their financing for particular areas of sustainable development. So whether it's health financing or climate financing, whatever, that also comes with strings attached. And for me, we always must go back to national governments and look at what the obligations of national governments are. And that's why I set out some of these normative agreements that they've signed up to. These are things that national governments have signed up to. These are not things that we are inventing. It's an obligation. So, you've said that you will end poverty, you will address the climate crisis. You're doing none of that. And so what is happening right now? And I think it's plain for everyone to see. So the new actors, I think that not new actors, but again, some of the countries that could have a very positive role and kind of step up are some of the larger economies. They can really finance gender equality, increase domestically, but also have a greater role internationally in making sure that there's resources for financing. As for the African Union and so on, I think there's a lot of discussion right now, and more than just discussion, there's action to make sure that we have better and fairer trade rules, that we have fairer taxation, that we have, so all of the building blocks that are needed to allow African economies to thrive, I think, are being put in place. So how do we then build on that and make sure that the African continent has the largest number of young people, has AI taking root in a way that is just incredible. How do you build on that and make sure that it's used to benefit all people and not just the elite or the rich? So I think there's a role to play, but are these countries stepping in? Because the other part of the world is interested just in one thing, and I'm not sure that's going to get us very far.
Yeah. So just to follow up, quick question. So Zohra, one thing you mentioned that in addition to not only that there is a lack of sufficient financing for gender budget, and financing for projects that have gender element. But also you noted in the beginning, that was a little bit, I was surprised that there has been 50% increase in the gap. Now, is it because that gender issue is taking back burner because of recent crisis, COVID, and then also there is there was until a year ago,
Mm.
that there was a lot of focus on climate adaptation financing. So what is the driver? What is the driver of that 50% increase in financing gap? It is not just we are not making progress in
No.
developing countries. It is going backward.
I think it comes back to Charles' very important question around social norms and things. We've been saying for some years that there's a backlash on gender equality. And we've seen it across the world. We've seen it codify, like, in things like gender apartheid, right? In some countries where girls are not allowed to go to school. We've seen a rise in kind of toxic masculinities and all of that. We've seen a rise in right-wing governments. And I think all of that has played a part in compounding the problem around financing for gender equality, because it's just not seen anymore as much of a priority for governments. And the culture wars, these culture wars that us gender activists and feminist activists start getting pulled into and sidetracked into, to me, it really deviates from some of the main struggles that we should be challenging now, such as the 1%, the people who don't pay taxes that are at the very top, the billionaires, so to speak. It's about making sure that we have a fairer and more kind of equitable system that everyone can benefit from. So I think that some of the reasons for this is certainly linked to the backlash, the rise in toxic masculinity, and the fact that it's just not seen as a priority as it should be. And UN Women has done a lot of work with civil society organizations and so on, actually thinking through this question of backlash and what does it mean for gender equality going forward. And we talk about the push forward, right? So that we have to not just accept that there's a backlash on gender equality, but we have to push forward. How do we push forward? It's precisely by the kinds of work that Joanna and others are doing. So it's working with local grassroots level civil society organizations that create the demand side for gender equality, that say to their governments, this is not sufficient, that we need to be doing better on ensuring that women have all of their rights in its totality realized. And that means investment. It means investing in the right things. So stop investing in things that actually don't lead to growth for our economies, that don't lead to a better life for everyone, and get the institutions and systems right. So it's like Charles was saying, looking at the economic and financial systems, those have a direct impact on societies, and then how social issues manifest themselves in our society. So does it create greater inequality? And then when it creates greater inequality, then what exactly happens? I was reading an article yesterday around masculinities and backlash around men feeling really threatened by economic inequality, and then really just taking that out on people that are closest to them. So domestic violence rates increasing because men feel, well, I can't get a job, I can't get a well-paid enough job. So what do I do? Who do I have power over? I don't have power over the government, but I have power over these people living in my home. So this is what I'm going to do. So I think these issues are all, very intricately linked. But we continue making the argument that investing in women, not, of course, to realize rights, but also is just the smartest investment you can make, because it builds human capital. It enables you to move closer to better, equitable, and more inclusive economic growth. You can't leave half your population behind. You can't get very far with that.
Okay. Oh, thank you.
Mm.
Anyone has any question? So since I will let me, Jora, ask one more question before
Sure.
anybody else, while they think, and then we will end it because it has been 1 hour for you already. One is that this is something, to the extent you can address it, you alluded to it that the role of AI, you think that due to AI, the gender inequality is likely to get worse. Is what you meant to say, or
So that's what our snapshot, that's what our research has found,
okay?
that there will be job losses. And to me, it makes a lot of sense because if you look at the jobs that are being lost to AI, it's the lower skilled jobs,
Hmm.
and women predominate in these lower skilled jobs globally. So your data, entry clerks, it's people in now even in tourism industry and hospitality. I mean, we saw that Tohir during COVID, right? That when the lockdown shutdown measures were introduced, it was women who were deeply impacted first because they were the frontline workers. They were those in the hospitality and tourism industry. They were the care workers and so on. So it was an immediate, very brutal impact on women before it then rippled into other sectors of the economy and therefore other types of workers. So because women are in this low skilled, low paid jobs and they want to automize at that level, we anticipate that there would be more job losses at that stage. However, please go and read our gender snapshot because it's got you'll see exactly where the data is from, and it's got lots of great facts and figures around the state of gender equality in the world today.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Jora. So okay,
Sure,
go ahead, Matthew.
Matthew.
Hi, my name is Matthew Bolts. I'm a student in the AREC. I'm an ag business major, so I was just kind of curious. I'm from Yuma, and my family farms there. What do you think the impact will be as far as AI is on like the farm worker themselves when it comes to, I guess, both men and women?
Matthew, can you repeat the impact of AI on men and women
On
for
farm labor.
huh? Oh, farm. So like agriculture workers, you mean?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Um, oh, Matthew, that's a great question. I don't know. Yeah, to be honest, I don't know what the impact will be. It would depend, I guess, to the extent that they automate some of those functions. And so I don't have a clear answer for you, unfortunately, Matthew. I mean, Toyd, what do you think?
I mean, so one thing is
Mm,
that, I mean, it is not clear, so
mm,
even I don't have direct answer to his question, that how does it affect the farm labor, but it could be that a lot of farm labor in terms of, it is not just AI, but it is machine automation. Automation is, so it is more than, when you think about automation, that definitely has significant impact on low skill jobs, so whether it is harvesting or planting, detection of pests and managements. So
mm,
in general, automation is supposed to be, uh, have adverse effect strongly on unskilled sectors, the sectors that require low skills. So agriculture will be definitely affected by it. For example, mechanization of agriculture had a huge impact on demand of labor, right? So in that sense, you would think that automation, whether it is AI or machine learning and mechanization of agriculture further, it will shrink the demand for labor force on agriculture as well. And there is an increasing trend towards further mechanization. In a scale of farm operation is increasing over time. So on average, the expected effect is going to be labor force pool for agriculture will shrink. The question is whether AI creates, this was also related to, I was going to ask Zohra about it, is that are there any upsides? That are there any sectors in which AI and automation going to create new opportunities in which women are benefited positively. So for example, right? So it is not just negative effect, but are there any sectors, Zohra, where you think that it might create better opportunities for women and related public policy issues?
Yeah, I don't, I mean, that's also a good question, and we don't know. It depends on how how AI evolves. But I mean, what we do know is, what we get from AI is what we feed into it, right?
Mm.
And so there's a lot of kind of stereotypes and bias also associated with AI. So I think that's incredibly important. A red flag, I think, for me to be watching as new technologies develop and what they are. I mean, I'm no expert in that area at all, but I think it's incredibly important to make sure that we don't have stereotypes and bias built into some of these systems. But I also just don't want I want to be clear. I don't want to come across as being like negative about
Mm.
AI. I think it holds great potential too. But it's like I read this funny meme the other day, and this woman was saying, I want AI to kind of not write my essay or not do my work, but clean my kitchen, cook my food. I wanted to do all of those tasks, right? The tasks that then free me up as a woman to be doing more creative things and to be channeling my energy towards other things. It's not you do the cooking and the cleaning and everything, and then AI is writing this wonderful, you know, uh, essay for you, or writing this or doing your kind of paid work, right? So I think it's how we use AI that's incredibly important. And I think for me, and I'm sure all of you will agree, the tools of AI and the development of AI is in the hands of people that are not really thinking about sustainable development and equity and equality for all and so on. And that's what we should be a little bit afraid of. If this is about a tool that allows society to be democratized, if it allows us to have greater access to lead better lives, then of course we're all for it. But I think now it's in the hands of a very few people who are seeing it very much as a tool for increasing profit. And so how do we grapple with some of those conversations around AI? I think are really important. The governance of AI is, I think, what we should be really focusing our attention on in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yes, thank you. So we have in the chat, Zohra, two questions. Maybe, I don't know whether you can see it.
Sure.
There are two questions that.
I don't see it, but
No, oh, okay, it was given sent directly to me.
okay.
Pranita, you are here? Pranita, if you are here, I see you
Yeah,
in the room. If you are here, please ask
yeah,
directly.
but I'm at work, so I cannot. Uh,
Okay, so she's not there. Second question, Sean, you are here? So one question is, Sean has asked question. He's based in Indonesia right now. And
Okay.
so he is asked, his question is there any discussion at UN system about moving away from uh, international aid to development finance, investment funding? So for example, like let's say foreign assistance, moving from foreign assistance to investment financing and funding. Something
Yeah.
along the line of, in US,
Mm,
one of the difference between Zohra, perhaps you know this, one of the difference between USAID and Millennium Development Challenge Corporation, so MCC, is that USAID was more focused on foreign assistance, humanitarian assistance. And Millennium Challenge Corporation, I have the pleasure of being as a member of Economic Advisory Council,
mm,
is that more in terms of investment funding, financing economic growth project, infrastructure projects, and they are not necessarily assistance, in terms of foreign aid. So what Sean is asking is there any conversation in UN system about moving away from foreign assistance to in to investment funding?
So I think, yes, there is. There's lots of discussion about that. And I don't think it's a new discussion. I think these are discussions that member states have been having for years now. But I think, what's incredibly important, I mean, there's two things. One is that when it comes to aid, those governments that are so-called contributors to aid, they've not met their commitments at all. There's agreed 0.7 many years ago, I think decades ago, and have not met 0.7. So I don't think that the advanced economies are doing sufficient to meet their development cooperation commitments anyway. So that's the one thing. But the second thing is that, yes, governments do want to be less aid dependent. And talk much more about investment and how do you attract more FDI and build your economy that way. So for sure, there are lots of discussions that take place, and many countries that are doing that already. Many countries are graduating from low income to middle income countries. So the kind of parameters around which they operate with regard to receiving aid and so on are changing rapidly. So we see that. But I think that there are states that are of the view that, especially in the context of climate change, that the kind of more advanced economies who are larger contributors to the problems around climate change should be held responsible for the impacts of climate change on economies that can't really protect themselves from the effects, and that's a loss and damage fund and all of that. So I think it's important to look at the financing in terms of a financing ecosystem and what different countries might need that are at different stages of development. The Indias and Chinas and so on are in a completely different league compared to the SIDS countries that still require a huge amount of aid, and now are really struggling with the effects of climate change in their local economies. So I think that, yeah, looking at that, but also the broader ecosystem is incredibly important.
Yes, thank you. So this is one last question, and then we will close it. We have kept you for long.
Thank you.
Stanishkar, please go ahead and ask.
Yeah, hi all. I am Stanishkar, PhD student in Texas Tech University. So I have a question related to India. So you told that India increased its funding to the gender equality, the sustainable development in last year in 2025, in this year 2025. So despite this increase, why do India still rank near the bottom in the reports like the Global Gender Gap Report? India ranked at 131 out of 148 economies. So what factors explain this discrepancy between spending and outcomes?
Hmm.
So
So
what's
thanks.
the reason?
Yeah, so I'm here in New York, so obviously not in India, and I feel that my colleagues in our India office will be able to answer this really well. But there are some things that I suspect could be reasons. So it's increased its spend on gender equality, but that doesn't mean that every single gender gap is going to be closed because of this increased spend, especially given the size of population size of India, right? It's a huge country, so I'm sure that there are very stark gender equality gaps across the different parts of India, and there are different types of problems that are experienced. So I think one of the reasons that there could be a gap is that even though it's increased, it's definitely not sufficient. So there might be an increase, but the need might be so much more greater. And the way you define need or identify need is through costing exercises. So you would cost in terms of what is the gender gap you want to close. Okay, you want more women in the or to increase women's labor force participation. What types of programs would that include? Where are women in the labor force now? And that's incredibly difficult work that needs to be undertaken. There are some countries that have done it. Some of the smaller European countries, I think, that have done that very well. I think India, given its the breadth of the country, the size of the population, and so on, it would be a very difficult thing to do, but not impossible. So I pointed out the India example, Stanishka, because I thought that it was a good kind of positive move towards something. towards increased financing. So it showed that there was a level of political will. But I also think that the country is plagued with lots of societal problems that keep women back. And again, to go back to, I think it was Charles's original question around social structure. I think for India, those would play an important role in increasing the gap between men and women. So I think the society plays social structure, society, issues of caste, class, etc., would play a role in why you are seeing that low performance on some of the global indicators.
Thank you, Zohra. With this, I would. The talk was really insightful, and I learned a lot of questions you can see, and so thank you for doing it, and everyone, thank you for participating today in the Friday afternoon, and you have a great weekend. And Zohra, I hope that we will host you in person at U of A sometime in the future, and
Wonderful.
that will be more meaningful. My colleagues and a student would like to meet you, and potentially, as I mentioned to you, I would look forward to opportunities to collaboration between IfAD and you and Women and your team. So with that, everyone, thank you for joining
Thank
us today.
you.
Thank you, Zohra, for a wonderful talk. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you,
Thank you so
everyone.
much. And thank you for having you and Women. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you.
you, everyone. Bye-bye.